As Jessica mentioned, I am with Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm a conservation implementation specialist there. And one thing we encourage is composting, because it is better at holding soil within, or pardon me, holding moisture within the soil, which reduces stormwater runoff. So that's really our bread and butter and our bailiwick at the Soil and Water District. So mostly I'll be talking about the post-feminist wave in 19th century Germany. I hope this is what you signed up for. Is that correct? I'm just kidding, everybody. I'm just kidding. Stay with me here. Stay with me. It's much more difficult to have a sense of humor when you're doing an online presentation here. So first, I'll start out with a few definitions of composting here. So pick one that you like best. So we're using natural processes to recycle organic material into a usable soil enrichment product. The biological reduction of organic waste into humus, that is not hummus, of course, which is the delicious garbanzo bean dip. Speeding up and intensifying natural processes, and a system for enhancing and thus accelerating the natural process of decomposition. So what are the benefits of composting? Compost is known as black gold for many reasons. And if you aren't already composting, I encourage you to give it a try because it is very unlikely that you will mess it up. But so one thing it does is it buffers the pH. So you might some of your garden soils or your garden plants rather as being plants that do better in acidic or alkaline conditions, when in reality some of the nutrients aren't available to those plants unless a specific pH allows it. So at the end of the day, when your compost is finished, it will end up being more or less neutral in nature. So it's a soil inoculant in that the beneficial animals and microbes and bacterial agents feed your soil and your plants over time and introduce some of the beneficial predatory insects that protect your plants. So as you know, no amount of fertilizer can make up for poor soil structure. And in our modern landscapes, a lot of our really valuable topsoil that has been formed over eons has been removed and replaced with very hardened, compacted subsoil. So by building our soil, we can get back to a nice humus-rich and well-draining soil media. In this, we reduce our fertilizer and pesticide use. We can reduce our food and yard waste and lessen greenhouse gas, particularly methane that arises from our landfill operations. And so compost is not known as a fertilizer because it doesn't necessarily have those big concentrations of nitrogen, potassium, and potash, but rather it has a lot of micronutrients that your plants still require in smaller amounts. And so your composting agents will work in sync with the growing cycles of your plants. So they're active when your plants need them the most. So what is the big deal then with composting like this, or why is this problematic for us? I wish I could see you and you can chime in, but essentially, some people might look upon this and say, well, this is a natural thing in a natural environment. So what's the problem? It's going to break down. Well, this is in fact a very large quantity of a somewhat unnatural product, right? And so the yard waste contains a lot of nutrients. And so we want the nutrients on our soil where plants can use them rather than in water where they could wash downstream and feed algal blooms. When those algal blooms then decompose, oxygen is robbed from the water column, resulting in fish kills and undrinkable water at times. So one does not simply start a compost pile by throwing fruit in the corner of a yard. I believe I stole this meme from a movie, although I do not know what movie. I hope that somebody does. Please do not turn me in for copyright infringement. Okay, so what kinds of things do you add to your compost pile? What does a compost pile need? You need 4 things: your carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and moisture. So in the top row there, you have your very carbon-rich materials. So things like your autumn leaves, which are abound this time of year, and you've got wood chips, paper, and straw. Hay, alternatively, would be a source of nitrogen. And so the greens on the bottom row are going to be the fresh, green, wet materials that provide the protein. So generally speaking, these bulky yard waste materials that provide structure to a lot of our plants are around in larger quantities this time of year, particularly leaves, of course. And greens are in supply usually year-round because, of course, we're always eating and producing all this nice organic material. So generally speaking, you need much more of the carbon-rich materials than the nitrogen-rich materials. So don't forget about oxygen and moisture, and we'll get to those points in a little bit here. So here we have a graphic of some appropriate greens, browns, things to avoid, and of course other materials that don't really fall into one of these categories. So kitchen scraps, as I mentioned, are generally fine, but just avoid adding too much in the way of oil or butter along with your kitchen scraps. Coffee grounds, as most people probably already know, tea bags, grass clippings are okay. Other garden waste, you do want to avoid things with weed seeds or tomatoes that have maybe gotten some sort of bacterial blight. Those things generally will still persist in your compost pile because most compost piles don't get hot enough to kill the bacteria and the pathogens. So along those lines, some kinds of animal manure is okay, like herbivorous animal bedding you can see there, and chicken and livestock manure, but stay away from a cat and dog waste because of those pathogens that we may not be able to kill. Feathers, hair, fur is okay. Dryer lint is okay, even though I don't see that on my list here. Just keep in mind what you are drying though. As you know, many of our clothes these days are synthetic and that doesn't exactly break down. But of course, if you're washing things like cotton and linens, those do pretty well in compost piles. So your brown materials, again, is going to be your dry, bulky materials that provide some structure in the landscape typically. So things like branches are okay. Some highly processed materials like cereal boxes, cardboards, brown paper bags are all okay. A lot of these things need to be broken down before they enter the compost pile, because if you don't, it'll just take a longer period of time. So let's see, some things to avoid. I covered disease plants and weed seeds. Invasive plants also, try to stay away from those and instead dispose of those in the trash. Let's see, some wood ashes are okay in moderation. They're typically very alkaline, but avoid charcoal and barbecue coals. Eggshells are okay, as well as some ground stones and shells that add some of those minerals and some different kinds of nutrients that way. So think of your compost pile as your microbiome. The more stuff you can add into the mix, the stronger your compost pile will be at the end of the day, and the better able it will be to be an inoculant for you. So once I got to learn about composting, I really found it pretty fascinating to learn about the life cycle that occurs within a compost pile. So all of these animals that you see on the screen are present in a compost pile, but some are present in different quantities at different times. And your compost pile, as you know, heats up, and that is the process of microbes and microscopic bacteria working and essentially eating and reproducing, and they're giving off that metabolic heat. So when you start composting, it'll start off pretty cool and it'll quickly heat up, and then it'll start coming back downhill. And so at those two ends of the spectrum of the start of the composting and the end, that is when you're going to see some of the larger macroscopic animals. So things like your beetles and your mites and your worms and your scorpions. And those are going to be your physical decomposition agents. So they're going to do the ripping and the tearing and the shredding. And they're going to break that down and allow other materials like fungi and bacteria to do the bulk of the lifting for you. Okay, so you may come across this magic ratio at some time, which is the proper ratio of 30:1. So every kind of organic material has a carbon and it has nitrogen, but some materials are higher in one quantity than the other. So there's various ways to try to get to the 30:1 ratio. And if you get really nerdy about it, you can go online and find a composting calculator. And I'll show you what I found here in just a moment here. But take a look at some of these more common composting materials here, like food scraps, grass clippings, coffee grounds, rotted manure. Of those things, manure is the highest in nitrogen. You may have heard that manure can sometimes burn plants. And this is where that comes from, is that really high proportion of nitrogen to carbon. And so some of those materials circled in the brown have a really high carbon content. The more carbon or carbon-rich materials you add, you will have to add a commensurate amount of a nitrogen material to break it down. If you have too many browns, your pile will not break down, at least not very quickly. And if you've got too many greens, your compost pile will be a little bit stinky and you'll be losing some of the valuable leachate and losing some of the methane to the atmosphere. So I just checked up on this link to make sure that it still exists, and it does. It's a county in, I believe, Washington State. So it's kind of cool. You can plug in your composting materials and then add, how many cubic feet you have, the approximate amount of moisture, the approximate weight, and it'll get you to the appropriate 30:1 ratio, and it'll make suggestions for you. So for example, here I added a part of grass, 2 parts of manure, which incidentally, cattle manure tends to have a lot of weed seeds in it, so be careful about that. 7 parts of leaf materials, and 4 parts newsprint, and I'm almost to the 30 ratio is what I want there. But really, again, don't let yourself worry too much about that ratio. So here I'm going to go over just some materials, and then you're going to try to play along with me and tell me whether or not you think this is a material that's high in carbon or high in nitrogen. So here we have, is this straw or hay? Maybe it looks like hay. So that's going to be on the greener side of things. So hopefully on your end, you're going to be saying, okay, that's higher in nitrogen, and you would be correct. So here we have a round-faced boy. He has got a wheelbarrow full of hearts. If those were hearts, if they were paper hearts, that would be a paper material, would be very high in carbon. If they are the hearts of his mortal enemies, that would of course be very high in nitrogen. Okay, here we've got Goofy with some plant materials, which are high in nitrogen, very good. And some weeds or some plants at the end of the fall season. Again, this is going to be your green sneaky material. That's going to be high in nitrogen. A wheelbarrow full of leaves are going to be high in carbon. And boy, the things you find on the internet. So here, of course, we have a hippo pushing around a zebra, and that's going to provide some very high nitrogen-rich material for you. Okay, newsprint, very high in carbon, and you're going to shred this stuff or rip it up to provide a lot of surface material, so the microorganisms have a lot of surface area to work from. And of course, you've got this schmuck just wanting to compost his piles of money so the government does not track him down. And of course, this is a high source of carbon-rich material. Okay, so I sometimes refer to this as the burnable to stinkable ratio, a little bit more user-friendly than carbon to nitrogen. So you can do a scenario that looks like 3 to 1. So 3 parts of volume carbon-rich materials to your nitrogen-rich material. You can also do a 1-to-1 ratio there. Now, the downside to this would be that if you overcompensate by adding too much of the stinkable stuff, you might, again, lose some of that methane gas. It might be a little bit stinky for you. But this is how you get to compost in a shorter amount of time if you tend it carefully. You can layer it like a cake, or you can toss it like a salad. Every time you rotate or agitate your compost pile, you are temporarily disturbing the critters that live in your compost pile. So typically, you want to give it at least a few days before you rotate or agitate your pile. And be careful about the layering. If you have something that's really highly concentrated, like leaf clippings or sawdust, you generally don't want to dump that all in at once, but you want to add it sparingly, one shallow layer at a time, because otherwise it tends to have some water repellent and oxygen repellent qualities to it. Okay, so a few pointers here. So be mindful that, and again, this is usually a problem if you're adding too much in the way of nitrogen-rich materials. You can actually overheat your compost pile if it is above 150 degrees. So it's like running a fever, and you will cancel out some of the beneficial bacteria. Usually in a home compost pile, this is not a problem. If you are interested in a hot composting pile, you will need to keep it at least 130 to 140 degrees for anywhere from 5 to 15 days. And this way you can add those weed seeds, you can add the tomato blight, but you've got to be a little bit careful about how you tend to that. So do turn your compost pile when the temperature drops below 100 degrees every 6 weeks to 3 months, also acceptable, or whenever you get around to it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you cannot mess up very terribly with composting. It's very forgiving. If you tend your pile very carefully, you will get compost in as little time as 3 months, but more realistically, most people might get compost, at the 6-month mark. And the ideal temperature for your compost is between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can buy a composting thermometer. It looks like a meat thermometer, except it's gigantic. But it's kind of a fun thing to do, especially in winter, is to monitor the heat of your compost pile. So how big should your compost pile be? It should be about the size of a washer, dishwasher. So we're talking about 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, so a cubic yard. So any larger than that, then you're going to be losing a lot of heat. The inside of the compost pile won't get the oxygen that it needs. If it's any smaller than that, it really doesn't have the mass to self-insulate. How do you get the oxygen to your compost pile? You usually will do this through the process of aeration or mixing every now and again. I've also seen people using those aerator tools. So that's the tool pictured there to the left of the screen, and it's flush. So when you poke it down into your compost pile, those tines fold up, and then once it enters the pile, they come down, and then you can rotate it that way. You can use a perforated PVC pipe to introduce some oxygen from the surface. I like to every now and again, or incorporate some branches, maybe layer them into the compost pile, every now and again to really reduce some compaction. And you want to make sure that your compost pile is on the medium moisture side of things. So usually rainwater is best because it doesn't have the minerals present in groundwater. So you might want to accomplish this by just having your compost piles, having the lid off of the bin during a rainstorm every now and then. Don't forget to put the lid back on the compost pile because some of the leachate will be removed and washed away from your compost pile. You do want to preserve that. And so you want a pile that's about as moist as a wrung out sponge. Okay. So just some more housekeeping tips here. Things to avoid, again, generally speaking, poo, meats, oils, and grease. In theory, you can compost meat. The problem with that, though, is that a lot of animals that you don't want in your backyard will be attracted to that. Some people even avoid composting kitchen scraps, and they'll only compost yard waste because they want to avoid attracting animals. So segueing into that, one way to deter animals is to layer and cover anything like attractive food waste. You can also chop it and break it down very finely and put it, in the center of your compost pile, so it's harder to get at. Turning it frequently and introducing that interruption will discourage animals from nesting. Place the bin away from other rodent food sources. So if you have a bird house or a bird feeder, or even a shed where some animals are known to hang out in the winter, get your bin away from those areas. So many prefabricated compost bins will come with air vents on the side. You can cover those up with something like a wire mesh or chicken wire. And again, keep that lid on there unless you're trying to introduce some rainwater into it. And generally speaking, you want to introduce some compost or some high quality topsoil into your compost bin. And so for those reasons, I recommend the kind that you just has an open bottom and you set it right, on your soil. However, if that's not the case, you can certainly use a tumbler, but be sure to add, again, something as a starter inoculant to it. You can put your compost bin on top of a stone paver or a wooden pallet to prevent burrowing. And you can add some gravel or some galvanized hardware cloth like you see there. So we'll get to the different kinds of composting bins and the benefits and advantages of each here. Okay, so the wire mesh, it's a pretty easy do-it-yourself kind of solution. It's not particularly attractive. It may not insulate as well as a nice plastic on the ground bin that you see. Wooden bins there, they can take up a lot of space. You'd have to figure out how to construct those and deconstruct those every now and again to get in there and turn the compost. Cinder blocks seem also a bit unwieldy, and in this particular example, this looks a little bit big. So again, how do you get in there and turn that stuff around periodically? The more common compost bins that I see are certainly these rotating drums and the plastic on the ground bins. So some people report that their rotating drum can be very heavy, especially when it has a lot of moisture in it. So keep that in mind, that you may not be able to turn that as easily as you would like. I also understand that it's really important to add the right ratio at one time to these rotating drums. And if you do that, and if you're pretty careful about it, again, you can get the compost in about 3 months. But otherwise, if you don't have all the right materials at the right time and you keep stuffing material into your tumbler, then your compost will never quite be ready all at the same time. So that's one drawback I see of the rotating drum. However, they are off the ground like that, so they don't pose a problem for rodents. That's probably the #1 advantage to that, and they look sort of neat. I myself prefer the plastic on the ground bin there. You can see at the very bottom of that, there's a tray or a window, and you can slide that up and access the compost from there. And they're also pretty lightweight, so you can just pick that whole thing up and move it to the side, rotate or turn your compost, and then just, pile it back into the bin. Now, bokashi composting is a little bit of a proprietary system. I haven't seen much of these around, but essentially you buy a mix that allows you to ferment anything, and you can make a compost tea out of it. You can also just throw the pre-fermented material into your compost pile to then finish the composting process. And I don't know if I have a photo of this, but of course there's also lombriculture or worm composting. So that's somewhat outside of the scope of this presentation, but that's a really good alternative for people who live in apartment complexes, for example. Just a smaller system way of again diverting some food waste. And so some of you may have heard about some of our invasive jumping worms. Those are not the composting red wigglers, even though both of these species are non-native, as well as are all earthworms. Really, we don't have any native worms to North America, but just be mindful of that if you are composting with worms, to dispose of them safely in the trash. If you have red wigglers and you're no longer interested in doing that, find a friend or dispose of them in the trash. But in theory, our winters are supposed to be cold enough to kill off these worms. Although more and more, I don't know that we get that severe weather anymore. So how do you know when your compost is done? So a few tips here. You should not be able to recognize the original materials that went into your compost pile. It is not heating up anymore. It smells earthy and sweet. It is crumbly and dark brown. So, your compost, as I mentioned before, is a wonderful inoculant. The more diversity of stuff you add to it, the more benefits it's going to bring to you. It is, and I just found this out kind of recently, a situation where you've got to use it or lose it. So you will be losing all these wonderful micronutrients to the environment right below your compost pile if you don't use it in your garden. Speaking of your garden, how do you use your compost? You can incorporate it into your garden soil, obviously. You can use it as a side dressing throughout the growing season. So just sort of packing it in lightly around your garden plants and your vegetables and your perennials. You can use it as a mulch. You can use it along with some perlite or vermiculite and soil to start your seeds in the very early spring. You can also use it as a top dressing for your lawn. So it's really handy, particularly following aeration, if you want to introduce some pore space and some bacterial action into your lawns. So I have some quiz questions for you. Hopefully you'll get these all right. So why is composting like wildlife management? You are managing the habitat of millions of animals, the decomposers. Number 2, how do I decide what to put in my compost bin? A, call a rocket scientist. B, enroll in organic chemistry. C, consult a Ouija board. D, mix browns and greens. Did you all get D right? I'm going to assume that you did. Help, my compost reeks of ammonia. What do I do? Give up composting, move, use it to mop your floors, or add brown material. The answer, of course, is D. If it does start to stink, introduce more oxygen and more of those bulky brown materials to absorb some of that excess moisture. Help, my compost smells like rotten eggs. What do I do? Hand out respirators, spray with perfume, make egg salad, or add a dry, coarse material. Of course, the answer is D. And yes, I realize the course is now spelled wrong. Thank you, everybody, for pointing that out to me. Help, I want a hot compost. How big should I make my bin? As big as a bread box, smaller than the Hindenburg, no bigger than your head, or at least 1 cubic yard. The answer is D. And I believe that is it for my presentation.
Oh. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I learned a whole bunch. I've been taking notes the entire time. So I have started to put some questions into the chat feature. I do recommend to everybody who is watching, please, again, hop on chat. Go ahead and type in your questions. Otherwise, we'll just make our way down this list real quick. But thank you, and good use of pictures and memes. I always enjoy that. All right, so the first question, how long do you have to wait for, so if you want to start composting and you want to start using lawn materials, if you used to chemically treat your lawn but no longer do so, how long do you have to wait until it's safe to compost?
I believe in the process of composting that those things are generally rendered inert. So once your compost pile is finished, so again, it's not heating up, it smells earthy and sweet, you should be good to go there. You may want to, on the safe side, just not use that around food materials. So maybe just your, your flowering annuals or perennials. So, but composting is it's pretty good like that. It is known to lock up some of the harmful materials in soil, like particular hydrocarbons and metals. The composting glue will bind to those materials and make them, not readily available for plants.
That is excellent. All right, next, how do you moderate the temperature of a pile?
So generally, in a home composting pile, you don't have to worry about it getting too hot. You can, as I mentioned, buy a composting thermometer. They look like a meat thermometer, but they're very large. You can just expect that it will be cooler at the beginning of the composting cycle and cooler at the end of it, and it'll peak somewhere in the middle there. I would say be careful about not adding too much in the way of nitrogen heavy materials. So erring on the side of, the 3 parts carbon rich material to 1 part nitrogen rich material should be an appropriate ratio, more or less.
Okay, so the list that you showed before that showed fever, so somebody gets the thermometer and it shows the fever range. So they can just let that be? I'm
sorry, Jessica, I didn't catch that.
Sure, so in the slide that you showed before that showed like the fever range, the upper range of the temperature. So if that's the case, then they don't have to modify anything if they don't want it that hot, or should they? And then how did they do that?
It depends on how quickly you want finished compost. If you're trying what we call hot composting, I would recommend buying a composting thermometer and taking its temperature every now and again and turning it more frequently. If you will want compost in about 6 months to a year, I don't think monitoring the temperature that closely is necessary. And at home pardon me, home composting piles generally do not get hot enough to worry about killing the beneficial bacteria. Which is why I don't recommend adding weed seeds or invasive plants or you know, cat or dog poo or stuff like that.
Okay. And there's a question, comment on here, just a reminder to, if you live in a place with a homeowners association, make sure to check the rules about compost bins, where you're able to put them, and some of them even specify what kind you're allowed to have if you are. All right. Next question, how does countertop composting work?
Oh yes, so you may have seen the bins that, well, they look like a real small trash can, and the kind I have has like a lid that's, it almost looks like mesh, but it's an odor-free kind of design. So essentially, you save your kitchen scraps into that bin, you know, and you'll take it out to the compost pile maybe a couple times a week. It's just a clever way to keep your kitchen scraps until you walk out to the compost pile with them. And you'll probably want to add them to the middle of the compost pile or layer them carefully, especially if they're delicious. Anything that you can break down by chopping or ripping, you know, it's going to mean that it breaks down more quickly than it would otherwise. But you know, you just keep it under your sink. You pull it out after every meal and put some kitchen scraps in there. Again, avoiding fats and oils and things like that. It's just they're really convenient.
Thank you. All right, Marty asks, does the annual backyards program include compost bins?
Why, yes, it does. I feel like Marty planted that question. So thank you, Marty. So we have our backyard conservation program. And so residents of Westerville can every year take a short stormwater quiz, and you can get up to $50 for a composting bin or a rain barrel or native plants. Hopefully most of you know about this program, but this also applies to worm composting. So yes, it certainly does include composting bins. Next year, we are considering working more closely with SWACO so that we can give you, the right kinds of bins, and that would eliminate you having to, go find the right kind of bin that we think is okay for you. And I did see, incidentally, regarding the city of Westerville, let's see, I wonder if I can share my screen here. The city of Westerville, as most of you may know, has a few different locations where you can bring your yard waste. And I don't see that.
We can see your screen if you wanted to pull that up.
I don't know if I have that available anymore. Oh, here we go. Let's see, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is westerville.org/services. So you can drop off your food waste at these 4 locations here. And it looks like they've got a pretty broad suite of what they can collect. Baked goods, beans, coffee grounds, even meat, dairy, eggs, eggshells, fruits, grains, pasta. So that's pretty cool. And sometimes this will work for you if you have a larger than normal, bulky materials that you don't know how to get rid of. Yeah, that's really handy. I think a lot of cities are doing this more frequently. And so this bin here, it looks like you can get one of these little under the counter compost bins for free there. So that's pretty nice.
Okay, someone else asks, is the ink in newspapers safe to compost?
Yes, it is, because these days it's soy-based, rather than being, having heavy metals used in that process. So it is safe to compost these days. Even the shiny colored stuff is okay to go. Now, keep in mind, newspapers and sawdust and things like that are very high on the carbon side of things, so they will want to break down for you very slowly. So if you can shred that or add it sparingly and do so in really shallow layers, you'll have better luck with newspapers there. And they are highly processed, right? So they won't be as beneficial for your compost pile as some other less processed materials, but they are certainly safe to go. And in some cases, it is the best source of a carbon-rich material throughout the year. Again, if you want to get really nerdy about composting, you can drive around this time of year and pick up all the yard waste bags that people are carelessly sitting out, and then put them in your storage area or your garage or what have you, and just use them year round. So again, depending on how many friends and partners you want to alienate from your life, that's a good pastime.
Thank you. Marty also shares, take your pumpkins to the food waste stations instead of putting them out for the trash. That is, if you beat the raccoons to them. All right. So I did have some other questions that haven't been written down yet. Have you heard, or could you tell us about mushroom composting? Is that because I've seen the bags in the stores, but is this like something you could add to, or how does it compare to regular like home composting?
I think it's less nutritionally dense than a compost pile that would receive all of the complements of the diversity of materials. But it adds soil structure, so it's okay to use. When people talk about creating rain gardens and stuff like that, I will say use pine fines or mushroom compost rather than manure or something that's very high in nutrients, because native plants don't really need a lot of the high nutrients, and in fact they'll become weedy and spindly looking if they have too many nutrients. So mushroom compost is very good for soil structure and just not particularly nutritionally dense. But you can add that to your regular compost pile or by itself just fine.
Okay. Somebody asks, are there any paper products that should not be used?
Paper products that should not be used. I think heavily soiled, say napkins or greasy products like that should probably stay out of the compost pile. But by and large, I think most stuff is okay. Like coffee filters are okay. Tea bags are okay. Let's see, waxy material is probably a no-go. Let's see, what else am I missing in here? I think
what about colored paper?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Colored paper and things like wrapping paper and tissue paper, I don't think those are even recyclable. Does anybody know differently? So maybe I would defer against putting them in your compost pile. But that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure about that. If they're not recyclable, then they, whatever makes them not recyclable might very well break down in the chemical process of composting. So I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's okay. So they ask, can you share any information on making leaf litter?
On making leaf litter, yes. So leaves, if left all alone and in a great big pile by themselves, will make their own kind of compost, and we call it leaf mold, and it's really wonderful. It'll take a little bit longer to get to that point of leaf mold, and if you can shred them or otherwise chop them into smaller pieces, you'll get there quicker. But leaves in and of themselves are a wonderful compost and can be, you know, added to your garden and provide some wonderful structure and nutrients over time. They do tend to be on the acidic side, especially, you know, things like oak trees. So yeah, they don't break down very readily or very quickly, especially if left in large pieces. So incidentally, they are really great homes for pollinators and overwintering insects. So if you have a space in your yard and you want to see these animals persist over the winter and you know, be around for future generations, push aside some of those leaf piles so that animals have a place to overwinter, and then you can deal with them, you know, or shred them up in the spring or use them in some other way.
Thank you. And I have a really noob question. How do you use the compost? Like, do you just put it on top of the soil? Do you have to mix it in? How do you use what you make?
You can do both of those things. You can use it on top of the soil as a top dressing or as a mulch, or you can incorporate it into the soil. Sometimes when the compost is not completely finished, sometimes people will worry that it will use, you know, it'll use some of the nitrogen within the soil. It'll essentially rob the nitrogen from the soil to break down. But I generally don't think that's too much of a concern. Let's see, what else can I say about that? So if you're concerned that your compost is not completely broken down, just keep it away a little bit from the crown or the base of your plants. You know, you can work it into the ground before it's done, and it'll eventually break down for you in the soil. But better to add it when it's completely finished. Let's say, as I mentioned earlier, you can use it as a top dressing on your lawn. You can use it to start seeds. Probably not so much in your house plants or anything like that. You know, you can use it, you know, parallel to your garden beds, within the garden beds itself as you're creating them. You know, compost itself is not topsoil, so make sure that, you know, you might want to get to maybe the 5 to 10% organic matter, but make sure that, you know, it's not just a bed full of compost that can actually somewhat have a water repellent quality to it. I don't know that I answered any question there, did I, Jessica?
No, you did. The follow-up question to that is, what will happen to your plants? Like, if it isn't ready, how will you know? Like, what will happen to your plants that means it was not ready?
Your plants might show a nitrogen deficiency, I suppose, and they might look a little bit anemic, and they won't have that bright green color. That would probably be a good telltale sign. But I don't think that is too much of an issue. But again, you know, if that is a concern, or if, you know, you just want to start a new batch of compost really quickly and get the old stuff out of the way, or you have too much compost, again, just keep it a little bit away from the base of the plant, and it'll eventually, you know, break down and incorporate itself.
All right, thank you. Everybody, I want to go ahead and invite you once more to put any questions that you might have in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute it this time, you can also do so. Otherwise, this is great. I've wanted to know how to do this forever. So thank you so much.
Don't be afraid. It's very fun. I mean, depending on your definition of fun, of course.
I don't know. I think you're safe. If somebody chose to come to this program on purpose, you're probably safe with that comment. So my other question, here's the lazy question. Do companies ever come and do this for you, like set it up for you?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you for asking. That's a good question. Yeah, so companies do. There's probably a number of them out there these days, but I think there's a Compost Columbus one. Maybe some of you have heard of that, but you can, they give you a bin or a bucket and you sit it outside, they come pick it up and they get it out of your hair and you're doing something good for the environment. You don't have to throw it away and take up this valuable landfill space. And I think you can even get compost back from them. In some cases, people just can't use it. You've got too much kitchen waste, but you don't have a garden. You live in an apartment like me. So that's a pretty handy way to get rid of it. And of course, like we mentioned earlier, some cities are now incorporating a curbside or a citywide way to begin composting on a larger scale if you can't do that at home. I don't know, does anybody else know if there are different services out there people can look into? Let's see, maybe I can pull up the chat here. Okay, I don't see any other questions and I don't hear anybody at this time.
Yeah, no, I think that is it for the questions. And again, thank you so much. This was entertaining and enlightening. So, all right. Well then, everybody, thank you for coming tonight. Sarah, again, very good job. And thank you. I would expect probably a lot of website clicks for your company today. So I'm definitely going to check that out. So everyone, thank you very much and have a good night. Sarah, you have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.